So now I know, Chief Craig, that everybody knows you in the city of Detroit, obviously, but still, as the candidate for the mayor of Detroit, I need you to tell me who you are in 2 minutes. For people who don't know you or people who may not know you.
2 minutes, okay.
Just like, yeah.
Well, I'm James Craig, former chief of police of Detroit, running for mayor of Detroit. And I grew up in Detroit. I matriculated at public school here in Detroit. I joined the Detroit Police Department in the late 70s. And certainly I was laid off. And so I was kind of pushed out of the city of Detroit. Ended up moving to the West Coast, Los Angeles, where I stayed almost 30 years. Then I achieved my life goal of becoming a police chief in Portland, Maine. Stayed there 2 years. Then I went on to Cincinnati. Stayed there 2 years as the chief of police. And then my ultimate goal, returning home to Detroit as Detroit's chief of police. Very difficult time, very challenging time given the bankruptcy. But when I talk about my 44-year public service, 44 years, the best 8 years was my last 8 years here in Detroit. So I'm excited about this opportunity.
Beautiful. So, for people who saw you run for governor, why do you want to be the next mayor of Detroit, and what qualifies you to lead the city right now at this critical juncture?
It is critical. This is a critical time. I applaud all the candidates who are running, but with Detroit right now, we need to keep the city's momentum going. I applaud the work that Mayor Duggan did. I worked very closely with Mayor Duggan, both as police chief and halfway through my tenure as his deputy mayor. So I understand how critical it is. I have the requisite experience. I know what it means to lead through crisis. What a lot of people forget is that when you're a mayor, a governor, a president, first and foremost, public safety is your #1 responsibility. And no one can dispute, given the work that we did here in Detroit in public safety, it still needs to continue and go to the next level. And so I know, given that experience and the changes that we made in the Detroit Police Department and how we embrace the community, because I've always had a neighborhood focus, and that's what's needed as we go into this next administration.
I have a couple of questions about safety, but that'll come a little later. But I do want to know, what's the biggest difference Detroiters will see between your administration and what we've seen with Mayor Duggan for 14 years?
Well, first of all, I kind of touched on it, the neighborhood focus. And while I agree that the mayor did a wonderful job at certainly doing so much in downtown, Greektown, and some of the other phenomenal areas in Detroit, and did some work in the neighborhoods too, especially removing blight. But one thing I've always heard and continue to hear as I'm now campaigning for mayor is some of the neighborhoods feel left out, and we have to do better. So what I plan to do is, with my neighborhood focus, go in, continue the removal of blight, continue to inspire small business development in the neighborhoods, because those create jobs. And we need to close that gap, that wealth gap. And so I'm focused on the neighborhoods, and that's one thing you would see differently. The other thing, because I'm about bringing people to tables, find out what's going on, and I know the mayor did a lot of that himself, but I'm gonna take it to the next level. It's critically important to understand where we are as a city, as a community, not two Detroits, as some would say, but one Detroit.
Detroiters have seen their fair share of corruption and how it has damaged our city in the past. What systems will you put in place to ensure transparency and public trust, which is of utmost importance to so many?
You know, Carolyn, I love that question. I think your viewers will know it's a James Craig. He always spoke the truth. He was transparent. They coined that that phrase, Hollywood Craig. It was a strategy with that. When I came into Detroit during bankruptcy, the community had lost total confidence in the police department. And police officers had lost confidence in police leadership. So it was important to bring both together, but I did it in a very transparent way. I talked about my expectations. I held people accountable. In fact, I always talk about how I changed out the top tier of the department, because we were in a 13-year federal oversight. And 1 year we got out of it. That's just one example. But more importantly, to address the crime issues in Detroit, and Carolyn, you may remember, we took 200+ officers at an apartment building on Jefferson. And we showed the community, yes, the police are back. That's transparency. But as important as transparency, and we talk about integrity, I never shied away from taking on bad issues in the department. You might remember I raided my own narcotics unit, and then I talked about it. That's what I give as mayor of the city of Detroit.
Okay. Let's talk about education. How will you ensure families in Detroit that they feel that when they put their kids in DPSCD, when they put their kids in these charter schools, that they will get a good education and learn how to read, learn math, learn all of the skills they need to go to higher education or to a skilled trade?
You know, I'm so passionate about public school education. As I indicated, I'm a product of public school. Although I went to the #1 high school in Detroit, Cass Tech, your viewers will appreciate that. But more important than that, right now our public schools are broken. And I know that infuriates some, but I speak truth. It resonated with me so much when I was running for governor because I found out, you know, when a child is in the 3rd grade, they must be able to read. But by the time they reach the 4th grade, they have to read to learn. Then, and this was probably 3 years ago, statistically, they said only 8% of Detroit students could read in the 3rd grade. That's an abject failure. If I had performed that way as chief of police, I would have lost my job. I understand the mayor doesn't control Detroit public schools. I'm committed to partnering with the teachers, the administration. I'm committed to making sure that we leverage funds out of the White House to help our schools, but we have got to change the trajectory of our Detroit public schools. It's unfair to the communities, the parents who live in those areas that don't have a choice but to send their children to school. So I'm going to work very vigorously to change that dynamic. And I'll use the bully pulpit or whatever I need to do to make sure that message gets out there and that we change what's going on with public schools in Detroit.
Let's talk about the deep divide that exists between downtown and the neighborhoods. And I know you touched on that and saying that you'll go into the neighborhoods, but how do you bring longtime residents together with all of the newcomers that are coming into Detroit, buying up homes as the home prices shoot up?
You know, that's an interesting question. You know, I'll be candid. I have some concerns about the land bank. I want to study it. I want to learn more because one of the complaints I hear from the residents is they can't get a land bank home. But then foreign investors, when I say foreign investors, maybe from other countries, from other states, come in, buy the properties up, and just let them sit. But if a Detroiter buys that property, I'm told that property ends up being foreclosed on or taken back by the land bank. That's wrong. And I want to fix that. There's a lot of things I want to fix. And I'm not being critical. I think conceptually the Detroit Land Bank makes good sense. But can we do better? Can we make it equitable so that Detroiters have a chance to home ownership? That's a big discussion. And we need to teach financial literacy. We need to have options where there can be no money down. And so I'm going to be working with the banking institutions so that we can close that gap.
And I was told there were 40,000 homes to begin with, and now I heard one number that there are only 3,000 left, and then I heard there were only 1,000 left out of Mayor Duggan's mouth. I don't know which number is correct, but that number is dwindling.
There's a problem there, and that's when we talk about transparency. We have to be about the business on an ongoing basis to report out to the Detroit community, here's where we are. Not during the State of the City, not half year. Maybe it's monthly, maybe it's quarterly. You know, on that line, you know, one of the things I'm saying, and I'll be very vigorous on this issue too, what's the current financial health of the city? One of the things I will do, day one, we'll launch an independent forensic audit to assess that, but not just do the audit, get the recommendations and report it out to Detroit, because Detroit needs to know, and not stop just there. Implement the recommendations. I'm not suggesting the financial health is poor, but we need to know in a very transparent way.
Now, if you are elected mayor of the city of Detroit, how will you ensure equity when it comes to city contracts and hiring and services, especially for Black and brown communities?
You know, that's a great question. Equity is so important. Fairness is important. Certainly that's where a lot of elected folks get in trouble. You know, they take money and make decisions based on that. You know, the mayor gets to set the tone. I believe that Mayor Duggan did a phenomenal job in his 3 terms in setting a tone of fairness. But I want to make sure that all can compete. And that's why I'm, you know, really pushing the whole small business development in the neighborhoods with a lot of minority because they want to create jobs. If you can't create small businesses in the communities, what happens to the city? I'll tell you, I met a young lady. She opened a business recently on the east side of Detroit, a cigar lounge. And I met with her, and she was telling me about all the bureaucratic red tape that she has had to go through. And she says, I have 3 businesses. So I curiously asked, where are the other 2 businesses? She said, in Dearborn. I said, Dearborn? She said, they're in Dearborn because it was seamless. We will have that in Detroit as the mayor. I promise that. That's a commitment I will make.
Now, as a former police chief, I know you know about this. I know I heard you talk about it endlessly, but what's your strategy now for gun violence, especially for these young kids in the city of Detroit?
You know, the work continues. I'm excited that on my watch as chief, we've reduced violent crime substantially. I know currently the Detroit Police Department, you know, has seen the lowest rates of homicides since the 60s. But that trend is going around the country. I don't get overly excited about stats. I mean, stats and metrics are a nice gauge. What I'm most important about is the perception of crime. I've had so many, I live in the city of Detroit, have the entire time, and community members approach me daily and said, Chief, we miss you. We wish you were back. And I said, why? I said, I just felt safer. The perception. Getting in front of a camera and said, we know who you are, I'm gonna find you, goes a long way in ensuring that I feel safe, because I'm not, and this is not a criticism of the administrations that followed me after I left, but we have to continue to work on perception of crime, and we have to continue to think out the box and implement strategies. On my watch, that we all know about green light and the impact that had. My first year, and to show you when you talk about crime, one of the most violent crimes, by the end of 2013, I came in July, 800 plus carjackings. So of course I had a dream and a vision about green light. And I don't want to go into details, I don't have the time to tell you, but on my last full year, just barely 200. And people felt safe. People would know, say, well, I'm gonna go to a green light gas station or a green light party store, because I know I'm gonna feel safe, and I know Detroit Police is gonna monitor that location while I'm in shopping, or a nurse who gets off at 2 o'clock in the morning and needs fuel for a car. I'm going to a green light station. Those are the kind of things that matter, but also, in addition to the strategy, coming out and educating the public.
To remind the people that you brought that in. Sometimes people forget that that's when green light started. You touched on this earlier. You talked about bringing jobs back to the city by having small businesses. How will you ensure Detroiters actually are the ones hired if jobs are brought back to the city?
Well, I'm going to applaud what Mike Duggan did. For the first time in probably 30 plus years, he was able to negotiate with Stellantis to bring the newest plant here in Detroit, the Jeep plant. And part of that negotiation was hire 3,500 Detroiters. He did that. One challenge though, and we talked about it earlier, public education, young people being able to pass an exam. So I'm gonna digress for a moment. When I graduated from Cass Tech, I was gonna be an automotive engineer, but I started working at Chrysler on the assembly line while going to engineering school during the day. So I'm on the assembly line. I didn't take a test. Modern day automobile manufacturing, you have to take a test. And if you can't pass basic academics, it's gonna be a challenge. So how do we hire Detroiters when some of them are receiving an inferior education? We must do better.
So true. You touched on blight as well, and I know we've gotten rid of a lot of abandoned properties in the city with Mayor Duggan, but how will you address the blight that's left? And what about city services in our neighborhoods in the city of Detroit?
Well, I'm glad you talked about that. I know the mayor, and I say this not as a criticism, when the mayor transitioned in, I was certainly here working in emergency management. The mayor focused on what I call the basics: street lights, salting streets, regular trash picks up, worked on transportation, so there will be more public transportation in underserved communities. Those things are critically important, and that work must continue. But we're beyond basics. And so every city I've lived, from Los Angeles to Cincinnati, we never talked about lights. We never had discussions about blight. I want us to move totally away from that, but we got to reassure the community that our service delivery is phenomenal. and that's what we did in the Detroit Police Department under my leadership. We changed the dynamic. Many will remember 911 calls for service, 1 hour. Clearance rate to a homicide, one of the lowest in the country, 11%. And we moved everything to a national average. That's important. And the delivery of our services has to be service excellence and hold people accountable. The real key in doing this is holding those in charge of the various departments accountable. And if they can't perform, they must go.
What's your message to that single mom or that dad on the city's east side that are looking at you right now, watching your interview, trying to feed their kids, trying to keep their kids safe, trying to keep the lights on in their house? What would you say to them that you're offering if you become mayor?
I got you. I had you when I was your chief. I'll have you as my mayor. Understand this is about, public service. I mean, we talk about politicians and being political, but I'm a public servant, and I've had a chance to go in many of those neighborhoods. I understand, I live on the east side of Detroit, proud to say so, although I grew up on the west side, so I got both sides of the city. But to those families, we want to make sure we have opportunities. We want to teach financial literacy. There's no reason why we have more black families renting today than we've ever had. And frankly, when I was young and talked about my time working in the plant, we had probably in the country more black home ownership than anywhere else. And now that's changed. And we can realize that future here in Detroit. And that's the promise.
Final thoughts. If you could accomplish just one thing in your first year that would define your legacy as mayor of the city of Detroit, what would it be and why?
Well, I can sit here and tell you about continuing to make the city safer, because that's my wheelhouse. But I just talked a little bit about service delivery. People complain mostly about, I call City Hall, I can't get through. I'm trying to start a business, it takes months. That red tape bureaucracy, that's not service delivery. We can and will do better. And that's going to change the trajectory. Again, not a criticism of the current administration. Again, when you talk about coming into a city in bankruptcy, no street lights, I mean, clearly that's a focus. But now I want to take it to the next level. I want to build on the great work that Mike Duggan did, take it to the next level. And part of that is how we deliver services equitably, not in certain neighborhoods like Palmer Woods, but as you talked about, folks on the east side. We did it when I was police chief. We delivered police services equitably. And in fact, we always deployed more officers to some of the more vulnerable neighborhoods in the city because there was more crime. It's got to be equitable, and that's the message I send, and that's what's going to make the difference.
Anything else you want to add?
I'm excited. Next year this time, I'll be mayor of Detroit.